The moment Kash Patel opened his mouth, the entire room shifted. What was supposed to be a routine oversight hearing instantly transformed into something far more explosive, a moment where the man leading the nation's top law enforcement agency appeared visibly rattled, cornered, and unsure of one of the most fundamental principles in American democracy. The first 30 seconds told viewers everything they needed to know. This wasn't political theater. This was a glimpse into a constitutional crisis unfolding in plain sight, and Patel's reaction set off alarms that no one in the room could ignore.
Senator Merkley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Director Patel. And so as I understood it, you testified yesterday that you'd like to have another $1 billion added on to the FY25 level to do the additional work you'd like to do on drug interdiction, fentanyl in general, and anti-terrorism. And today you gave us a budget that requests cutting $500 million. Which is it? Do you want us to, what are you asking of this committee? To add funds, add $1 billion, or to cut $500 million?
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate the opportunity. What I'm asking for is that with more, I can simply do more. And I was giving examples of what more I could do. I can do the mission, and I am in support of the budget here, and I'm working with appropriators and you to fill the gaps.
So you support the budget presented that cuts $500 million, but you also support us adding $1 billion should we choose to do that?
Well, I can't not support the budget as proposed, because then I would be supporting no budget.
Okay. Well, we've got those two options. We do look forward to further details from you about how you plan to modify the function of FBI on these different missions that you've highlighted today, so that we can give it the appropriate consideration. Mm-hmm. Director Patel, you're familiar with the Fifth Amendment.
Yes, Senator.
And it is really the freedom clause of the United States. It was 4 years into being a nation when Congress and the states said, hey, we have to make sure that there's not an over-aggressive government in the future that deprives us of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And you're familiar that that applies to all persons in the United States.
Yes, Senator.
So there's been a lot of concern about the several hundred immigrants who were swept off the streets of America and sent to El Salvador without due process. And does that concern you?
Senator, I'm not in a position to comment on whether or not they were given or not given due process or are supposed to be afforded due process. All the FBI did and all the FBI will continue to do is arrest those that have violated the law.
Okay, but to arrest, you have to investigate. Have you launched an investigation of this violation of the Freedom Clause of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, I don't know that I agree with your characterization.
Well, that was my first question, whether or not you agree with the Fifth Amendment and are prepared to defend it. It is your job to investigate crimes.
Yes, I agree with the Fifth Amendment. I agree with the entire Constitution, and the men and women at the FBI decide.
So are you going to launch an investigation of the reported violation of the due process of several hundred individuals?
Again, Senator, it's not for me to call the balls and strikes on it. The men and women at the FBI who are trained to open investigations will make those calls.
So you have no influence over whether an investigation is opened?
I have influence over it, but you're asking me a constitutional question. I'm not a constitutional scholar.
Well, it's actually not it's a question also of law.
But your position is that every one of those individuals is by constitutional right afforded due process. I don't know the answer to that. I'm telling you.
You haven't read the Constitution?
It
says all persons.
I've got it right here, but what you're saying is that every single one of the illegals that was sent down to El Salvador is supposed to be given due process pursuant.
Yeah, that's what the Constitution says. It says no person.
It doesn't say that.
It does say no person. Yeah, I'll encourage you to read it, because it's also been affirmed by the Supreme Court repeatedly. In the case of Miranda versus Arizona, held the right of all individuals, regardless of citizenship status, the Supreme Court in Reno versus Flores. I mean, but it's the plain language of the Constitution. It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons as written in black and white in the Constitution.
As the first public defender who's ever served at the FBI as its director, I'm more aware of due process than any predecessor in my seat. You are delineating between removal proceedings and criminal acts. My job is to investigate criminal acts. That's what we do.
You are aware that the Fifth Amendment refers to taking away liberty, and when people are arrested on the street, detained and sent out of the country, that their liberty has been taken away.
Senator, that is a constitutional question that you are asking me to answer. It's not for me to answer.
The question has already been answered by the Supreme Court that they're protected. Therefore, it's a violation of law, and it's your responsibility to open an investigation. And you're saying today you will not do so?
I am not the agency involved in removal proceedings. That is a different branch of government.
So if an agency other than the FBI violates the law and the Constitution, you will not investigate because it's a different agency?
I will investigate every violation of law.
Well, you have, but you just said you're not investigating.
No. You and I are in disagreement on what is a violation of law. I have yet to hear from the Supreme Court your position as you have adjudicated it.
Well, very, very interesting, because the Supreme Court's been very clear, and I had heard you were trained in the law, so I expected maybe you would try to uphold it. You also took an oath to the Constitution.
Thank you for the reminder.
Well, it's important to remind you, since you're apparently unfamiliar with the very basics of the core protection of freedom in our Constitution.
What I am familiar with is protecting the American public, and that's what
Let me close with one question, Mr. Chairman. Will you make sure that due process in every action of the FBI is completely honored under your time as director?
Will I ensure that due process is followed?
Yes.
Under the Constitution?
Completely. Send that message throughout the FBI that due process must be followed, is constitutionally required. Make sure that it's done under your direction.
Sure.
Great. Thank you.
It all began with a simple question, one Patel should have been prepared for, whether he stood behind his own budget request. Just 24 hours earlier, he said he needed an additional $1 billion for drug interdiction, anti-terror operations, and the ever-expanding challenges facing federal law enforcement. But the budget in front of the committee told a different story. Instead of asking for more, it cut $500 million. The confusion wasn't subtle, and when the senator pressed him, Patel tried to stand on both sides of the argument at the same time. With more I can do more, he said, while also supporting the cut that left his agency with less. His tone was stiff, unclear, and viewers could sense the unease beginning to creep into his voice. But the budget contradiction was just the doorway into something deeper and far more consequential. Because once the senator had Patel publicly contradicting himself, he pivoted sharply, straight into the question that would define the entire confrontation. "Director Patel," he said, "you're familiar with the Fifth Amendment, yes?" Patel nodded. He had to. But what followed showed just how unprepared he was for what came next. The senator reminded Patel that the Fifth Amendment is the core protection against government overreach. It's the clause that says no person, not citizen, not resident, not visitor, not undocumented individual, may be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The language is clear, the intent is unmistakable, and the senator made sure the hearing room felt the weight of that clarity. But when pressed on how this principle applies in real-world cases, particularly to reports suggesting that several hundred immigrants were swept from American streets and removed to El Salvador without hearings, Patel froze. He didn't affirm the principle, he didn't reject the allegation. Instead, he said the words that left the entire room stunned, "I'm not a constitutional scholar." The reaction was immediate. You could practically feel the oxygen leave the room. Because this wasn't some obscure legal theory or arcane procedural rule, this was due process, the foundation of American liberty, the bedrock of every legal protection the FBI relies on, the guiding principle that the founders wrote into the Constitution precisely to prevent government officials from abusing their power. And the man responsible for leading the FBI, for overseeing investigations that directly affect people's freedom, was distancing himself from the very concept at the heart of his job. The senator's expression hardened instantly. Viewers watching at home felt the tension through the screen. This wasn't about winning a political point, it was about calling out a fundamental misunderstanding of the Constitution from someone who cannot afford to misunderstand it. When Patel insisted he wasn't prepared to comment on whether those individuals were afforded due process, the senator cut him off. Because investigations aren't optional. Accountability isn't optional. and due process certainly isn't optional. Yet Patel kept retreating behind vague bureaucratic language, insisting it wasn't his place, insisting he had no comment, insisting that the men and women at the FBI would decide if an investigation was warranted. But that wasn't the question. The question was whether he as director acknowledged that the Fifth Amendment applied to every person inside the borders of the United States, and when asked directly, he said, "I don't know the answer to that." That was the moment everything cracked open. The senator snapped back not with anger, but with precision. "You haven't read the Constitution," he said, pulling out a copy and reading the words aloud. "It says all persons." It wasn't speculation, it wasn't partisan spin, it was the text itself, black ink on white paper, written by the founders, upheld repeatedly by the Supreme Court. Yet Patel hesitated, still trying to draw distinctions between criminal acts and removal proceedings, as though the Constitution applies only when convenient. The senator reminded him again and again that liberty, the freedom to live, move, exist without being detained or taken away, falls under the explicit protection of the Fifth Amendment. And when people are removed from the country without the right to challenge it, that freedom is unquestionably denied. At that point, it no longer mattered whether Patel wanted to call himself a constitutional scholar. What mattered was whether he believed in the principles he swore to uphold. His reaction said more than any prepared statement ever could. Viewers could see the unease building as Patel tried to navigate the senator's questions. It was the kind of discomfort that happens when someone knows the answer is obvious but can't bring themselves to say it. When the senator asked whether he would open an investigation into the reported violations of due process, Patel dodged again. "I don't agree with your characterization," he said. But it wasn't about characterization, it was about the plain language of the Constitution and decades of case law affirming it. And that's when the senator delivered the line that echoed far beyond the hearing room. "It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons." He wasn't raising a hypothetical concern, he was sounding an alarm. Because what happens when the person responsible for protecting rights doesn't fully understand them? What happens when the official empowered to prevent abuses can't even say whether a major constitutional protection applies universally? What happens when the leader of an agency with sweeping authority responds to fundamental questions of liberty by saying, "That's not for me to answer"? That's when systems begin to slip, that's when rights become conditional, that's when government power starts to move in the wrong direction. Some observers have speculated carefully and with appropriate framing that the exchange may reveal deeper confusion inside federal agencies about their role in the removal of individuals. Others believe the moment exposed something even more troubling, a willingness to sidestep constitutional guarantees when they become politically inconvenient. While none of this is confirmed, the public reaction has been intense, with many pointing out that such uncertainty at the top of law enforcement could signal a broader institutional problem. And here's the truth, the senator was trying to drag into the light, due process is not a courtesy. It is not a suggestion, it is not a privilege reserved for specific people, it is a right, one that keeps democracy from collapsing into arbitrary decision-making. The moment the government is allowed to deny due process to one person, it gains the power to deny it to anyone. Rights are not protected by restricting them to certain groups, rights are protected by applying them universally. That is the principle the founders built into the Constitution, and that is the principle Patel struggled to articulate. The senator wasn't asking him for a lecture on legal theory. He wasn't asking him to interpret centuries of jurisprudence. He was asking if the FBI director believed the Constitution applied to everyone. And when Patel hesitated, something deeper was exposed, a crack in the foundation, a moment of uncertainty from someone who cannot afford uncertainty. The exchange became even more symbolic when Patel, holding the Constitution, said, "I have it right here." The senator responded, "I encourage you to read it." That line landed because it captured the essence of the problem. Holding the Constitution is easy. Waving it around is easy. Quoting it selectively is easy. But actually upholding it, especially when it challenges powerful institutions, is far harder. And that is what this moment revealed, the difference between using the Constitution as a prop and living by its principles. As the hearing reached its final moments, the senator asked Patel for one promise. Just one. Will you ensure that due process is fully honored in every action of the FBI under your direction? It should have been the easiest question of Patel's entire career, and yet the pause before he answered said everything. He finally replied yes, but the hesitation lingered, leaving a shadow over the entire exchange. Because promises made under pressure are not always promises kept. The real question now isn't whether Patel said the right thing in the end. The real question is whether he meant it, whether he understands it, whether he will act on it, and whether this hearing will be remembered as a turning point, or a warning that went unheeded. This wasn't just a clash between two officials, it was a test of the country's commitment to the principles that define it, a reminder that power must always be questioned, and rights must always be defended, a wake-up call to anyone who believes democracy is self-sustaining. It isn't. Democracy survives only when people, leaders, citizens, viewers, refuse to look away when something is wrong. And if you're watching this, it means you care about the truth, you care about accountability, you care about the Constitution not as a historical document, but as a living promise that still matters today. So stay aware, stay informed, and stay engaged. If you want more deep dive breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. Your voice matters, your awareness matters, and together, we can keep shining a light where it's needed most.